Good afternoon, and welcome to another episode of the Bookham Nook Show. My name is Kyle Colley, and this is an episode of Founders Talk Podcast, a podcast for founders to tell their stories, ideas, and visions of the future. This episode is brought to you by Bookham, the book community's new and best way to host dynamic online book clubs. Download the app and start your book club today at www.bookhamapp.com. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to our channel. My guest today is the greenlighter Brooke Warren. Brooke started in the book publishing space at 23 and has been a trailblazer in the space. She has supported over 700 books in the publication in her amazing 22 years in the publishing space. She is the publisher of She Writes Press, SparkPress, and the president of Warren Coaching, Inc. Brooke is also the author of Write On Sisters, Greenlight Your Book, What's Your Book, and 3 other great memoirs. She is a gate opener, a podcaster, a writer. She crushed her TED Talk, by the way, and a game changer in the book space. Brooke, welcome to the Founders Talk podcast.
Thanks, Kyle. I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, absolutely. And speaking of the concept of greenlighters, can you explain some of the many hats you wear and just like how you've helped other authors greenlight themselves?
Yeah, absolutely. It's there are different ways. I primarily think I do so through book publishing, specifically being a publisher and someone who publishes books. I have the 2 imprints, She Writes Press and SparkPress. I also teach primarily memoir. I go to writers' conferences where I talk about publishing and memoir writing and the whole concept of greenlighting, just because I do believe that there needs to be a conversation about opening up this space for authors beyond just the world of traditional publishing. And then I support authors to write their books, to get their books published. So I come at the industry from a lot of different angles. And as you said, I have a podcast. So I see myself as an author advocate, sort of above all things.
Yeah, and what I really do enjoy about some of the conversations you have on your blog is even when you talk about authors, like being author-centric and being a publisher that really helps the author as a whole in a space that sometimes often authors, I wouldn't say get exploited or anything like that, but just have harder times like navigating. So can you share a little bit about your insights and like some of the important lessons you've learned throughout your career?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think it's not too far to say that authors sometimes get exploited, and that's why it is important to be so educated about the space and what you're doing. I've had this long career in book publishing, and when I first started, it was always so central about traditional publishing, and this is all that there is. But over the years, as you well know, the landscape has changed tremendously. It's exciting because there's more access for authors than ever, and that's what I most love about it. I mean, I like this idea that if you have a book or you have an idea or a concept or poems, whatever it is that you do, that that there's an outlet for that book to be out in the world. And it's not only one path. Authors can take multiple paths, and they might publish one book one way and the next book another way. And I actually love the industry because it's so complex and varied. And the whole independent space to me is exciting because I think there's a lot of people in this space that are particularly motivated in a way that I didn't experience when I was in traditional publishing, just because that the sort of skin in the game idea, right? That if you're going to go do it yourself, maybe you're going to try a little harder or be a little more invested and certainly be more humble. So I don't know that I'm exactly answering your question, but just this idea of the bigger space appeals to me.
Oh yeah, you did. And then even when you talk about having skin in the game, talk to me about when you had that Eff'it moment. I know you talked about that in your TEDx talk. Like, talk to me when you were like, all right, I'm going all in on publishing and helping in that space, specifically when it comes to hybrid publishing it.
Yeah, exactly. The Eff'it moment was for me about leaving traditional publishing, and it was a building up for me because I was having to reject books that I really thought should be published. And so you get into this tense situation as an acquiring editor when you bring in books that you love and you really want them to move ahead, but they get rejected by the marketing department, or they get rejected by the corporate entity for reasons having to do with money, or they think that there's not enough audience, or they will say like, oh, okay, well, we've already done a book very similar to that in the last year or 2 or 3. And so those are frustrating moments for editors for sure. So I had one in particular, it's the story of my TEDx talk that was the straw that broke the camel's back, because it was a book about trans families. The author was a trans man. And I really loved this book. I thought it was important. We hadn't done something like that before. And I had been tasked with building our LGBTQ list. And so when they said, essentially, we don't want it, you can acquire it, but it's on you if it fails. It was this really strange moment where I just felt very unsupported, and like this book that seemed like a slam dunk obvious choice to me was getting shut down. And so from that point forward, I just was disillusioned. I was seeing much more interesting things happening in the non-traditional space. And I think a lot of people have that Eff'it moment, in different capacities, right? And it just like your thinking shifts all of a sudden, and new possibilities open up that maybe you didn't see before.
Yeah, I think it's so important because otherwise those stories don't get told, right? And because there's that level of, at least when, and it seems like from a traditional standpoint, that level of gatekeeping versus when you go to a hybrid publishing model, you have the backing and help of a publisher, but you can do it in different unique ways. Can you talk a little bit about like I guess the myths or like the different routes of like when it comes to the gatekeeping and traditional publishing versus how hybrid publishing allows you to have more flexibility
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the gatekeeping in traditional publishing has just gotten more and more constricted, or more difficult to penetrate, right? And it makes sense because of their business model, right? I mean, that is the difference between, like, the hybrid business model allows authors to have more collaboration and more creative control because they're investing. And so it feels more like a co-publishing relationship, right? It's like the author is coming and saying, I'm going to put some money into this and see where it goes. But the publisher, as long as it is a legitimate good hybrid, is saying, we have the relationships, we have the distribution, we have all the mechanisms in place, the infrastructure that you need to be a successful author. So in that way, that kind of collaboration is very different than the traditional publishing side, where we're saying, we choose you and we're going to give you money. It could be a little, it could be a lot. But what happens in the we choose you and the we're going to give you money and we're paying for everything is that there's an expectation there, obviously, of success. And if and when the author does not have success, the publisher is unlikely to continue to support them, will usually not publish their second book. So it sets up a dynamic, it really comes down to a power dynamic in a sense. And if an author is selling books for their publisher, that power dynamic is going to stay either even, or sometimes the author has more power, but more often than not, the publisher has more power. And so on the hybrid side, I think there's a more even power dynamic, and or the author is saying, look, I'm investing, I have skin in the game. So like that whole paradigm that we're talking about of skin in the game, to me, I just prefer to work with authors who have that incentive, and that wherewithal. And I think it makes for more proactive authors and kind of a more exciting publishing experience.
Yeah, it's so interesting. So, and that trickles down, right? So we work with a lot of content creators in the book space that end up promoting, whether it's advanced reader copies or just authors that they really love. But that comes down to it because then the content creators are basically given a lot of their marketing for free in that sense because of all these trickle down effects that happen in publishing. So I'm kind of curious, especially since we're talking from a founder's perspective, what are some of those contrarian beliefs you have about publishing that's now trickled into how you run your company?
Well, say more, like, just so I understand what you're saying, the contrarian beliefs being something about like whether you should be paid to write,
Well,
or
that, but more so like just in publishing in general, like some of those contrarian beliefs that kind of started how you run your company in that sense. That's maybe different from other even different hybrid companies.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting. It's like I think, this idea of like disrupting from the inside, right? Where like the best disruptors are the people who really know what they're doing. And so I think that what I took from my time in traditional publishing, which was 13 years, is that there are some systems that really do function well inside of traditional publishing, right? Like there's access and there is the way that books ought to be created. There's professionalism, there's all these things that really matter. And so on that level, we're offering all of those things to our authors, all the things that I think are essential to being a good published author. And yet, I guess the contrarian point is like, there's a lot of people who think or thought it's changing and has changed. Certainly, that the entire idea of investing is like less than, that there's some problem with it. And yet, on the side of making films or music or whatever, that's just not a stigma. And so
Yeah.
I think that publishing has changed in that way, of like authors taking the reins a bit more. I mean, self-publishing has opened that up, of course. And so in traditional publishing, there's this notion that like authors shouldn't be involved in anything. You turn in your manuscript and then you just say yes to everything that the publisher tells you. And so what we're doing is different. I mean, we're enrolling the author in a lot of education. So a lot of the things that seem contrarian are like obvious. They should be happening everywhere. And partly that's also like just being more transparent, right? And so many industries, not just book publishing, are very not transparent. But that was one of the goals that I always had in starting these imprints, that we would be very transparent to our authors.
So speaking of other industries, especially like with music, do you think even like a 360 deal would work in form of I know it's a little different, but I'm just curious of how that might work even in publishing.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. You're saying like the splits?
Yeah, because like when music is like, yeah, it's like in the 360, I think it basically works out you get 50% of everything that goes. So it's like whether it's touring, press, movie rights, like that all gets
Right.
spun into your whole deal. So I was wondering
Got
if any
it.
publishers have ever thought even of doing something like that where,
Well, I mean, I think that is reserved for like the biggest and the best
yeah,
deals that are coming out of traditional publishing, where they're throwing everything because they really want that author. And so they
mm,
will say, like you're getting publicity and you're getting, the full 9 yards. And the problem with that is that it's the 1% that get that treatment.
exactly.
And what the publisher takes is a lot, right? So like they might throw a lot of money at you and all these incentives, but then what you're getting is like 7% of royalties. And while, it's almost like a little bit of a devil's bargain because you're saying, oh, cool, like I'll take 100 grand and I'll get a tour and I'll get all of this stuff. If it works out for you, then that's awesome. Like if you sell enough books and you become, a desirable author on that list. And again, that's just, it's few and far between that usually works out for. And for the others, they end up being pariahs in essence because they didn't earn out,
Yeah.
and the publisher threw all this money at them. And so I just think it's a little bit of a problematic setup. Like when it works, it works. And when it doesn't, the author kind of gets screwed. And so, certainly those 360 deals aren't something that we're looking at in hybrid. And it's just in the sense that we're, it's the authors are investing, but certainly the authors are looking at all the different things that they can do. And I've found it really interesting that lately authors are choosing to spend more money, for instance, on advertising
Yeah.
than they are on publicity, right? So there's shifts that are happening in the industry of, authors just being more savvy about where to spend their money.
Yep. And then so tell us about those early days of starting your company, She Writes Press as well as SparkPress. Like getting customers, getting authors, like how that all work.
Yeah, the early days were interesting for me because I started She Writes Press. And at the time, shewrites.com was kind of a big deal.
Yeah.
It was a platform for women writers. It sort of felt like Facebook. It actually kind of felt more like Substack. Like you could put articles on it and it had a big membership. So we started She Writes Press on top of that platform. So there was already sort of a built-in market of people who were interested in publishing. So we have had the great luxury of never having to advertise, almost
Yeah.
out the gate. People were like, cool, that's interesting. What are you doing? And it grew much, much faster than I ever could have imagined. And then SparkPress came around about 2 years later when I partnered with Crystal Patriarch, who is our CEO. She had an imprint and I had She Writes. And the two actually were very similar. Like she was doing something hybrid and she was looking for a publisher and I was looking for someone who could do publicity.
Yeah.
So we partnered and became, one entity with two imprints. But the presses are, they function the same way, but that's the story of why there are two imprints.
Yep, that makes sense. And then, so from that, like, how do you share some of those like important initiative or ideas in the space? I know that you tend to be like more of a literary agent, I mean, activist in this space. So I read your blog. So just like, what are some of those ideas that you're really trying to push in this space so that people continue to have different alternatives and routes in publishing?
Yeah, thank you for asking that question. I mean, I think the subs you're talking about blog, I started, because I have a lot of things I want to say about book publishing. I mean, I write about writing sometimes, but also about publishing. I like to point people's attention to things, I mean, I like to talk about fairness, certainly I like to advocate for hybrid because I think it's bullshit that people are still trying to insist that traditional is the only or the best way. And it's not to disparage traditional, it's just to say most people are not going to get a traditional deal. And so having the open conversation about alternate paths to publishing to me is quite important. I mean, publishing is a wild space, and I mean, it's just had so much around like diversity, equity, and inclusion in the last few years. And so stories come up, I like to weigh in, just sort of say like, look, this is what's happening. And I feel like I have a perspective that is like just from being a long time person in this industry and having come at it from a lot of different angles and seeing a lot of change. And so I'm whatever sparks my curiosity, but I oftentimes am fueled by the things that bother me,
Mhm.
and then try to sort of make sense of them and point things out to my readers so that they can see what's what in the industry.
Yep, that makes sense. And that's very much again how a founder really thinks in the sense of I see a problem in the world. I believe I'm the type of person that can make a change in it. Or sometimes it's the reluctant founder where it's like, I know I'm the right person for this space that I have to go do it. But either way, it comes from that space of wanting to do something important for the world and help those that have voices and in these stories that should be told. And speaking of that, when it comes to these stories being told, they have to be marketed well. Can you explain a little bit like how marketing plays in how you all do marketing and then also the role of the author when it comes to marketing their books?
Yeah, for sure. Our marketing efforts are a little bit bifurcated in the sense that some of the marketing happens from our distributor, right? So like we have distribution and we opt ourselves into various marketing programs. So I think people don't see that. It's largely invisible that when a publisher has a distribution company, that there are these sort of like internal efforts that are happening to get the books out into the world in all kinds of different ways. And essentially those are like promotions. They include Amazon promotions. Our authors do largely work with publicists. But again, that is another thing that they have to hire. So the hybrid publishing arrangement does mean that the authors are investing and they're, hiring publicists. And so there's a way in which the authors are building their team. And so the publicists are, of course, a really crucial element of doing the marketing and publicity for the books. We do a lot of internal stuff like, on our own social media, on our own newsletters, so there's a degree of working to get the book out into the world. And then, as I mentioned earlier, there's a lot more authors who are doing their own advertising. So that's through Amazon ads, Facebook ads. I have found actually that those two channels are the most successful for selling our kinds of books, because we do fiction
Okay.
and memoir, and because our authors are primarily female, those Facebook and Amazon tend to be places where kind of middle-aged women and older hang out. And so you have to figure out, of course, like TikTok would be better for a younger readership, right? So there's lots of marketing efforts. I mean, it's coming from us, it's coming from our distributor, and it's coming from what the authors are generating.
Yeah, and is it easy to? I know that Barnes and Noble kind of changed how they do books, which makes it kind of harder for indie publishers to get. I mean, indie authors to get into their stores. But have you found that it's easy to get books into local bookstores for authors as well, or how does that
Yeah,
work?
well, for us, yes, because of our distribution, right? So
Okay.
we currently have distribution with Publishers Group West, but we're moving to Simon and Schuster in
Yeah,
August. And so when you have traditional distribution, the people on the bookstore side are like, oh, everything looks, like it's supposed to look and it's easy and the books are returnable. So that's where self-published authors get into so much trouble, right? Because they go onto the back end and they're like, red flag, red flag, red flag. And so it's like, as long as the green boxes are checked and everything looks good, then the bookstores will not have any reluctance buying. And so we have great success getting into indie bookstores. Barnes and Noble, yes, admittedly, is a little bit tricky these days. I think one of the problems is that they did this changeover, and some of the managers like really understand how to be, like independent bookstore oriented. But some of them, I think, like they haven't been appropriately trained. It's like they don't actually realize like how to place the orders, or maybe they're just telling us that they don't know how. I mean, we've had a lot of issues with Barnes and Noble lately, which I have been trying to crack that code, but also hoping that it's going to get better once we go to Simon and Schuster.
Yeah, I hope that for you as well. Does Backlist play a big part into your publishing company as well, or?
Yeah, for sure. Backlist is interesting because that's like supposedly where you generate most of your income, right? Because if you have a really good selling book, it will drive the sales forever. And that's a lot of how, the big companies have the kind of money that they have. They're just perennially selling all of these big books. So our backlist is strong. The thing is that most of that profit generation goes to authors.
Yeah.
And so it doesn't help us as much as it would help, Random House or Simon and Schuster. That said, it's awesome for authors to continue to generate income, like 8-10 years later. So the backlist matters to us insofar as like we're keeping our books in print, but the amount of money that we're getting, from our backlist is not as significant as traditional publisher.
Yeah, I want to shift into you as a writer. But before that, what are just some success? I would love for you to share about some successes your publishing companies have had and anything that you're super proud of.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I mean, like, it's just interesting. You mentioned the backlist, and the first book that came to mind for me was our book called The Complete Enneagram. And it's one of the first books that we published. It has a pub date from 2013, so it's been in print for more than 10 years. It sells like crazy. I mean, like thousands of
Wow.
books every year. And it just is one of those books, like, people are crazy for the Enneagram. It's a personality test, and it just has been a book that has consistently done well for us. And so it's very exciting for me every time I open that author's royalty statement to like, she's getting a great payout, year over year over year over year. So that's just one example of kind of our flagship backlist book. On the other side, on the publishing side, I mean, we've had a few really strong memoirs that have published over the years. That's exciting to me because I feel like memoir is a place where authors get stymied in the traditional world, like they don't know where to go.
Yeah.
Every season we have a few real standout titles. I feel like our sales are strong. And in terms of something that I'm proud about, I mean, I want to just mention that we have a step contest. It's called She Writes Towards Equity in Publishing. And it comes to mind because it's open right now, depending on when this airs. But through the summer, we basically hold a contest to award 2 contracts to writers of color, one on
Very
each
cool.
imprint. And we've been doing that since 2018. So we've published something like 10 books so far. So people can find that on our website, or if you just Google Step Contest, She Writes Press. But this is a good opportunity to say, A, I'm proud of it. B, I hope people will enter.
Wonderful. Yeah, I'll make sure to put that in the show notes. As we shift a
Cool.
little bit to your writing, when did writing become significant to you, like when growing up, like, and how have you utilized writing to empower yourself and others?
Yeah, well, interestingly, like a lot of kids, I was into writing. I mean, I recall very strongly, especially like in 3rd and 4th grade. And then I had some teachers that ruined it for me, like more than one, but notably my junior year, like literature professor, and I had done some writing and he just eviscerated my writing, and it really turned me off to writing. And sadly so, I have to say, because I didn't write for years, and then I went into publishing, and it wasn't until I left traditional publishing really that I decided I need to write a book. And that was my first book, What's Your Book? And that's when I think I also found that I had a voice that was about writing, writing about publishing. And so that was like 33 by the time I got there, so like for all of those years, I didn't think it was not my thing, but I was supporting writers, and I wasn't a writer myself. And so I think I like to tell that story just because I think a lot of people get off the rails a little bit because of unsupportive people in their lives. I mean, it could be their parents, it could be their partners, it could be teachers. And it's such a disservice, that people lose their creative spark because other people don't see the value in that particular creative milieu. And I love writing. I mean, now in the last decade plus, it's been a real central force of my life.
Yeah, it's very well said, Brooke, because so often, even with reading, it's like just because, all right, cool kids aren't reading, therefore I'm not reading, or these
Right.
people writing is cool up to a point, but then sports becomes the main thing. It's so many times, but when you get older, you're like, wow, I wish I read all these books because reading helps you become a better conversationalist. It helps you understand the world better. Or when you write, it's like writing helps you clear up your thinking more than
Yeah.
you can even just listening to 1,000 podcasts or anything else. Like it really plays a big part in that. So like speaking of that, like how do you what's your writing process like? How's that for you?
Gosh, I mean, it depends. Like for my Substack, it's very regimented. I'm like, I've got this, I got it my topic. It's like I know how to do these kind of short pieces. There may be 1,000 words. So those I can usually finesse, might take an hour or two. I get like clarity of thinking and I do them usually on the weekends. When it comes to personal writing, oh my God, my process is a mess. Like I've been working on a memoir, and it's like it's just there's so much more emotion and it's been, like I don't want to go there. I don't want to revisit that part of my life, or I do, and then I'm like I judge it, So I think one of the reasons that I like memoir and I teach memoir is because I find it a very courageous genre, to open up your past and to examine, what happened and to make sense of that for other people. And I love reading memoir for the exact reason you said, to understand other people, to see different life experiences. It just makes you so much more empathetic,
Oh
right?
yeah.
And so I feel like I wear two different process hats, like one very regimented and clear-headed, and the other one kind of undisciplined
Yeah.
and like finding my way.
No, yeah, I love autobiographies, memoirs, all that because especially like when you're growing up, you're like, okay, I'm this age, and a lot of times you don't always see like I guess if you're reading into like other successful people, you're like you think that they had it all figured out or something, right? But you
Right.
realize that a lot of times they were just inventing and wandering. They were figuring things out. Like it's kind of I think what's that one? It's like all that wander aren't lost. But a lot of times you see those in those stories when you read a memoir. So I really do appreciate those. Um,
Yeah.
I do want to shift a little bit into you as a podcaster and talk
Mm.
about can you talk a little bit about Right Minded podcast, what it's about, and just like some of the interesting things about it.
Yeah, well, we have, so I have a co-host, Grant Faulkner, who has been the executive director of NaNoWriMo, which is National Novel
Good.
Writing Month. And so he and I came together with like my love for memoir and his love for fiction, and we're like, we're going to do a podcast about inspiration, right? Just to like keep authors motivated in their own process. And so we always have a topic and then we discuss that topic, just the two of us for like 10 minutes. And then we bring on a guest and we always interview an author and sometimes industry people. So like sometimes we'll interview agents and other people. And then after the interview, we do a trend, so that's another thing that I really like because I'm kind of keeping my finger on the pulse of what is happening in book publishing. And that keeps my eyes open to all the things. We joke that oftentimes our trends are all negative, but it's good, and we're coming on 6 years of doing this summer.
Congrats.
So it's been yeah, thank you. It's been a great journey.
No, that's great. And then last but not least, I always like to get into the reading side of people. So talk to me a little bit about the last books you've read, what you're currently reading, and what you plan to read next.
No, thank you. I mean, a lot of my reading list is driven by who we're about to interview.
Yeah.
for the podcast. I
Sure.
mean, that's one of the things of having authors. So like right now I'm reading The Sympathizer by Viet Thanh Nguyen.
Mhm.
But it's cool because The Sympathizer just came out on HBO Max as a show. So I'm like, I've never read a book at the same time I'm watching a show, which I'm finding like quite interesting. But the downside of that is that the protagonist in my head is the actor, right? And I actually love when you read fiction that you just imagine what the
Exactly.
protagonist looks like in your own mind, so I found that like, I don't know if I like that or not. The most recent memoir that I read was, gosh, I'll have to think. I guess the most recent memoir I read was for my class too. I have to say, like, it's a lot driven by what I'm teaching. But Abigail Thomas's "What Comes Next and How to Like It," which is a classic, and I absolutely love. I have like such a love for memoir and prolifically reading in memoir all the time. So, I'm sure you can relate. Like I listen to audiobooks, I read on my reading device, and I read regular books. And so I feel like there's always maybe two or three going on at the same time.
Yes, I can completely understand. Let's get into a quick rapid fire here. What's the important book that no one's reading or talking about that you want to share about?
Thank you for asking. I actually brought this one. It's called The Scandal of Cal. And the reason that I chose this is because Heyday Publishing is actually here in Berkeley and they're right down the street. And this book is about uncovering some of the honestly atrocities that Cal has been adjacent to with regard to the Native American population. And they are like holding Native artifacts in the catacombs of Cal and not releasing them to the tribes. And I just think it's like a really important expose. So I definitely hope that's one that people will check out. And also, it supports indie publishers.
Perfect. And then also, what's like a podcast episode of yours that you recommend someone should listen to?
Oh my gosh, there are so many. I guess some of my favorites that stand out are authors that I love, of course, that I admire so much. So Maggie Smith is the most recent memoirist whose podcast episode I just absolutely adored. She wrote You Could Make This Place Beautiful. One of my all-time favorites, just because I am so in love with him, is Kiese Layman. I
Oh yeah,
reference him all the time. He's just like, I love Heavy, and I just think he is such a generous human being. And he gave us a gorgeous interview. It's a couple years old now, but truly loved it. We interviewed Mary Carr, which was a huge privilege because she is sort of the godmother of memoir and one of my idols. We've just interviewed so many incredible people, and that's one of the big gifts of having a podcast, is like it's about inspiration, but I get inspired myself.
perfect. And then last one on these ones is just like a recent book or blog. I mean, recent book blog or article that you recommend reading.
I have to say, just in keeping on my topic of memoir, that I would recommend Carmen Maria Machado's In the Dream House. But Carmen Maria Machado is like an amazing author of short stories. She's doing a lot of like gothic. She's a genre hopper, and like all of her stuff is just kind of dark and interesting and unique. And I just think she's such an incredible writer. So she's someone who transports you.
Perfect. And the way I like to end this podcast is it's a two-sided question, but what aspect would you like to see more of in the book world?
Oh gosh. I mean, in so many ways, the book world has improved a lot. I mean, one of the things I love is seeing the diversity of authors and more voices. I think that we have come a long way as an industry. One of the things that I think is so disheartening right now is stuff like book bans, and backlashes and just people trying to police what we're reading. So I think one thing I would love is just for more authors and readers to recognize the consequences of that and just to like insist and push back on that not happening, right? Go to your school board meetings, take it seriously, because if we lose control of that conversation, we are really truly doomed as a country. Books are everything, and you're hearing that like reading is down with kids, and that's just because we need to be able to find ways to promote books to them that they're excited about. So much of that is just about advocacy, and getting out there, share a book with a kid, do more reading yourself, listen to more book podcasts. Yeah, just all of that to make reading and books central to your life.
That's well said. And on the opposite side, what aspect would you like to see less of in the book world?
Well, some of the same things, I guess, yeah, less controlling of what other people think we should read. I mean, I just find that incredibly insane, and it's so politicized. Like when reading gets politicized, again, we're in trouble. I guess because of the hybrid space that I'm in, I'd like to see fewer people thinking that there's like one best way to publish, or that if you somehow are traditionally published, that you are automatically better than anyone else, because it's just not true. This idea of judging a book by the content and the story and in the message and not by how it got published is incredibly important to me. So yeah, I'd just like to see less less rigidity of thinking, about what are the best ways for any given author to publish.
Makes sense to me. Well, thank you, Brooke, so much for being on the podcast.
Thanks, Kyle. So good to be with you.
Yep, sounds good. Take care and have a great rest of your day.
You too.